So yeah, so my PhD and kind of where I'm going with my life is clinical psychology. So I am working towards becoming a clinical psychologist. So I'm curious if anyone has any ideas or thoughts about what you think of when you think of a psychologist, or you know, do you guys have any ideas of what that means or what a psychologist does or anything like that?
Is it like someone who like studies the brain or like thoughts and feelings or emotions we have?
Yeah, exactly. That's great. So that is a huge part of what we do, is studying the brain and understanding better kind of how people's brains work, how they think, and also what goes wrong when people have various psychological disorders. Well, yeah, so that's a great start. And I'm going to talk more about what this involves. Kind of one of the things I love about this career path, and one of the reasons I chose it, is it's pretty versatile. There's a lot of kind of different things involved in what we do. And so it's nice because you kind of have a lot of options, even with this one path that you go down. So I'm going to start with a brief little introduction about myself, just so that I'm not a totally random face. So this is my family. They are in Washington State right now, which is where I grew up. So I grew up with my mom and dad and sister, and I'm now across the country from them. So I miss them a lot, but I here in Pittsburgh have my cat Bella to keep me company. And I also have my fiance to keep me company. So, you know, we make do over here in Pittsburgh. So after I grew up in Washington State and went to high school, let me go back. So growing up in Washington, starting from a pretty young age, I started playing a lot of instruments. Starting from the age of 5, I was playing the piano and the guitar and all these different things. And so I really loved my music classes in elementary and middle school, and I decided pretty early on that I was going to be a music teacher. And so I spent most of my time in every music group I could be in, taking every music lesson I could, and that was my plan. My plan was to be a high school music teacher, and when I applied to college, that was my goal too. So I was applying to places that I knew had good music programs and places that I could pursue this. But I'd also always loved the academic side of school. I loved science and math and things like that. And so even though I knew I was going to pursue music, I still wanted to be able to double major in something more science-based. So I still got to pursue that interest of mine in college. And so what I decided to pursue was environmental earth science. And I did that at Washington University in St. Louis. So this is where I did my undergrad education. So I moved to St. Louis for my freshman year, and I was a double major right off the bat in music and environmental science. And this was a really, really great experience. So the music stuff was exactly what I'd always dreamed of. I was part of a really great field research program in the environmental earth science department at our school. So in addition to the classes I took, we also went on various field research trips. We went on one to the Mojave Desert and did a lot of work learning about the geology of deserts. And then in my following year, my sophomore year, we actually went to Hawaii because, as you might know, volcanoes and volcanic activity also play a huge role in geology and rock formation and such. So I got a lot of really amazing opportunities through that. That being said, by the end of my first year of college, I was like, you know what, the environment's really cool. And that was the reason I'd really been interested in this, because I care a lot about the earth and climate change and things like that. But when you're studying environmental earth science, a lot of that is studying things like rocks. And rocks are very cool, and there are people who like to study them, and I'm very happy for them. But I realized by the end of my first year that that was not for me. I could not stare at rocks for any longer, and I needed to be done. So the summer after my first year of college, I was like, okay, I know I still want to be a music teacher. Music is still my thing, but I got to change my second major because I can't make it 3 more years doing this. So honestly, I just kind of started thinking and looking through majors and wondering what other science major I could pursue that I'd be interested in. So as I'm thinking about this, I started to think a little bit more about growing up with my sister. So you might have noticed from my first picture that my sister's in a wheelchair. And that's because she has a diagnosis of cerebral palsy. And so what that means is that she was born with kind of issues with her brain that make a variety of things hard. So cerebral palsy can span a wide range of things. Some people are only affected by some muscle issues. So they're totally fine in every other way. They function totally normally, but they might have a little trouble walking or a little trouble using their hands or something like that. But there's also a much more severe end of that spectrum, which my sister's on, where you also have a lot of trouble being able to do basic things like learn to read or write or even talk. So my sister can't talk or walk or any of those things either. So I knew this obviously from a young age because I grew up with her, and I had always been fascinated and confused by this idea that something that happened in her brain that we couldn't even identify, that we couldn't see or understand really, had somehow caused these vast differences in what people are able to do, right? And what my sister's able to do. And while people say that she is intellectually disabled, that's the term for this because she can't walk or talk or learn to read or learn to do math or anything like this, somehow she does still have these amazing skills, like she can clearly understand multiple languages and has been able to, the languages that my family speaks from an early age. She has an incredible memory, much better than mine or my family's ever has been. So this was really, really confusing to me. Like, how can the brain be so impaired and also so able to do so many things? That's fascinating. And so I was like, you know what? I think the brain is it. This is my next path. Like, I really want to learn more about this. I have 3 years in college. Let's do this. So I switched. So I kept my music major, but my second major was actually known as, this is an obnoxiously long name, but it's philosophy, neuroscience, psychology. So there's 3 things encompassed in there, but they all really fit together really well. And that's because neuroscience is a relatively new science in that we've made a lot of progress really recently, but a lot of what we know has only come in the last maybe couple hundred years. And so before that, neuroscience was really almost entirely philosophy, which what that means is people were really just kind of thinking about, what does it mean? What is the difference between the mind and the brain? Is there a difference? Where does all of this live? How does the brain affect behavior? And without any idea of how to explore this using science and scientific methods, people just had to kind of think about it and decide what they thought might be the right answer. So anyway, so I was studying a little bit of philosophy, but mostly neuroscience really heavily and psychology really heavily. So through my second year, I started pursuing this major. And I started to take some psychology classes, and I started to really, really like them. And it was really confusing because, as I mentioned from the beginning, I had decided I wanted to be a music teacher at the age of 7. And now here I was at age 19 or 20, and all of a sudden I was like, do I really want to be a music teacher? Because this brain stuff is really, really cool. And so as I was thinking about this, I took this class called abnormal psychology. And that was really a turning point for me. I see we have some fans. But yeah, so abnormal psychology is really the study of various psychological disorders and how they come about. And I was completely fascinated by this, and I had a fantastic professor. His name was Dr. Ryan Bogdan, and he really made this subject come alive, both in the way he taught it and the way he was able to share his own experience as a clinical psychologist working with these different disorders. And so about halfway through the class, I finally made the choice that not only do I think that studying the brain and studying psychology is what I really want to do, but this particular class, this clinical psychology stuff, this is really for me. Like, this makes sense. I want to help people. I want to understand the brain better. Like, this is the whole package. So here I was halfway through college, and I was going to completely change trajectories from the 13 years that I'd had thinking I was going to do one thing into something totally different. I had no idea what it entailed to be a clinical psychologist or how to get there or anything, but I knew it was what I wanted to do. So I decided I wanted to do this, and I actually went and talked to my professor for that class, and I knew that he had this, that he had been a clinical psychologist for some time. So I went to him and basically said, hey, this class has inspired me, and this is what I want to do. How do I do it? What's the deal? Give me the scoop. And so he explained this to me. So basically becoming a clinical psychologist entails getting a PhD. It's a longer PhD than some other PhD programs. So you can get a PhD in pretty much any subject, as you might be aware. But how you do it and what's involved in that is really different. So every PhD involves some amount of research, which I'm going to talk a little about kind of what that entails on a day-to-day basis and what you do as a researcher. But as a clinical psychologist, as you might get from the word clinical, we also do a lot of clinical work. And so there's a lot of extra studying involved in being able to responsibly do clinical work with people also. So being able to do therapy with people with various psychological disorders and help with the diagnosis and treatment of those people involves a lot of additional education.
Yeah. Hi, I'm sorry to interrupt. We had a question in the chat.
Oh yeah, sorry, I can't see that, but yes.
No, it's fine, it's fine. That's why I just wanted to break in real quick. We had one student, Danielle, ask, is a psychologist the same thing as a therapist?
That's a great question. So not exactly, but they do heavily overlap. So therapists can have many different educational backgrounds. There are therapists with master's degrees in counseling or master's degrees in social work or a variety of other areas. And then there are also PhD levels, and there's another degree called a PsyD, which is actually very specific to psychology. And all of these people can be considered therapists or can act as therapists. What changes, I guess, is one, the type of therapy you'll be doing depending on your background, and two, the level of responsibility you're able to have. So while a master's level therapist would usually be almost entirely doing therapy with patients one-on-one, a PhD level therapist may be able to do more assessment and diagnosis of those people and supervision of master's level therapists. So it's really just a sense of what level of supervision you're able to do, but they do heavily overlap. So that's a great question, and it's one that confuses a lot of people. So thank you for asking that. Yes, so clinical psychology involves this PhD. It's a little longer than other PhDs, so it's actually usually about a 6-year program at minimum because you're doing research and you're also taking quite a few classes in order to be able to responsibly do clinical work with people who have various psychological disorders. So I learned all of this. I said, okay, but then I was also told that in order to get into one of these PhD programs, I was going to need to have a lot of research experience under my belt, because like I said, a big portion of all of these PhDs is research. And people expect you not to know everything about the research you're doing coming in, but just have some sense of, to have some experience with it, to have some idea of how to do at least a few things. You've got to have that ready to go. And so I knew that I needed to start figuring that out. I had 2 years left of college and I had to see what I could do to get some experience going for me. So I started in a lab soon after that at the Children's Hospital of St. Louis. I was working with my principal investigator, Cynthia Rogers, who was the head of this lab. And she was working on a really fascinating project that worked with mothers of babies in the neonatal intensive care unit. So just to clarify, the neonatal intensive care unit, which I'm going to call NICU for short because that's a lot of words to say, is basically a part of the hospital where premature babies go to kind of be cared for a longer period which as is usually the case, they have some issues maybe with their breathing being underdeveloped or other parts of their bodies being underdeveloped. And so they need a little extra care before they can go home. Now, as you might imagine, or as you might not have thought of before, having a baby in the NICU is really stressful for parents because the normal situation or the normal way things go is you go to the hospital, mom goes into labor, mother has a baby. Parents are really happy, parents take baby home, and you're really excited and happy about your baby. So when your baby is born prematurely and you have to take your baby to the NICU and you have to watch your baby lie in the hospital for weeks, maybe months at a time, that's really, really stressful for parents. And for a lot of parents, that can lead to a lot of psychological disorders. In addition to that, we know that mothers who have their babies in the NICU are more likely to develop postpartum depression. I don't know how much you guys have heard of this, but postpartum depression is basically depression that directly follows a mom giving birth to a baby. So there are all these hormonal changes that happen as a mom when you give birth to a child, and it's believed that some of that is what causes this sudden onset of depression, but it's really specific to this period. And so this research project was really just born out of my PI's desire to have all of these mothers screened for postpartum depression, because it's really important that people know as soon as possible if these mothers are on the brink of developing depression, so that they can get treatment as soon as possible, because we know that the earlier people get treatment, the better they do overall. And so the only way she could get funding to be able to start to screen these mothers as quickly as possible and provide treatment was to turn it into a study. And so that's what she did. And that was a phenomenal experience to see a clinician be able to make that happen by turning it into research. But two, it was really nice because one, it gave me a sense of starting to do research. I learned to do some statistical analyses and to conduct some basic questionnaire type measures that I'll need to learn for future research. But it also started to give me a sense of what clinical work would be like, because I would shadow a social worker who also acts as a therapist in this service, who would go around and talk to these moms, start to screen them for depression, start to help them kind of on a shorter term basis deal with their symptoms of depression or kind of other things that they were going through. So this was fantastic. I was learning a lot. And then after maybe a year of that, I decided that because I really wanted to go to grad school and I thought I wanted to go right after college, I needed to up my level of research experience that I was getting. So I joined a second lab that I was working in simultaneously. And this was actually, if you'll recognize the picture, with the same professor who taught my abnormal psychology class. He had some openings for undergraduate researchers, and I said, I loved your class, so I'm definitely going to like your research. So I joined his lab, and he was working on a very different type of research. So his research was much more neuroscience focused. He was doing MRI scanning on people. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with an MRI scanner, but I actually have a picture of it later in the section. Presentation, which I'll show. But it's basically a big machine that we send people into, and we're able to get pretty good quality images of what their brains look like. And based on that information, both about what their brains look like and about what their brains are doing while they're in that scanner, we're able to learn a lot about various functions of people's brains that we're trying to understand. So in this lab, I was looking at that in relation to people's genetics. So looking at genes to see how different genes affect the way that different people's brains turn out. And then in addition to that, looking at how those things relate to things like symptoms of depression that people might be having, or symptoms of anxiety that people might be having, and how all these things work together. Right? So really putting together brain and this clinical psychology stuff that we had going on. So I really enjoyed this type of research, and towards, this is, I'm maybe halfway through my senior year of college now. This is when I realized that I have a lot of research experience now, but I don't think it's enough for me to go to the grad school I want to go to. And so I started to look at, or I was suggested and then started to look at options for doing some research after college, but before grad school. So this was a really hard decision for me to make, because a lot of people tend to, and especially people in my parents' generation, tend to think that the right path is to go to high school, go to college, go to grad school, and then go do your job. And the fact of the matter is, especially in today's world, that it's just not that easy. It's not that linear, and not everyone has that trajectory. And it's oftentimes not the best trajectory. So for me, I really felt that for this career, what was going to be really helpful for me was to get 1 or 2 years of additional research experience just working as a researcher under my belt before I went to apply for my PhD. So I applied to a few places, and I ended up working at the National Institute of Mental Health, which is a government organization that works on this type of research. So we worked in Washington, D.C. I moved to D.C. Following my graduation from college. And this is where I went to get that additional research experience that I felt would be really helpful. And I worked in the lab with, this is my PI from there, her name was Dr. Karen Berman, and she did research on a variety of things. She didn't have a great focus to her lab because the projects really spanned the gamut. But for me, as someone who was still deciding what I really was most interested in and what I really wanted to pursue in grad school, it was super helpful because within this one lab, I was able to pursue so many different types of research and see so many different types of psychiatric problems and things like that, and really figure out what it is that I was most interested in. Before I keep going, are there any additional questions right now or anything like that that people want to ask?
We have one question. Is it difficult to find a job to be a psychologist?
Great question. So as I'll talk about in a little bit, I don't think it is, but I think it depends on what you want to do with it. So as I mentioned at the beginning, the nice thing about this degree and about this career path is that there are a lot of different things you can do with this degree. Some people go on to pursue the type of position where they're a professor at a university, which is what, say, my abnormal psych professor was doing. And in that case, your time would mainly be research and teaching. Those jobs are pretty hard to come by because positions throughout college, for a variety of reasons, are difficult, one, to get, and two, to keep. But that is one path. However, many of the people I know, both within this program that I'm in and other programs who have left with this degree, have also ended up either being full-time psychologists or therapists, so working fully in a clinical capacity. Sometimes they end up in industry, so working with various different companies and really just using your research background to help them do the types of studies they want to do. And they can also be working in a hospital setting. So then instead of doing research and teaching like you would at a university, you'd be doing research and clinical work. So there's really a huge range of things you can do. And so for that reason, I say no to your question. But like I said, if you're dead set on being a professor at a university, then yeah, it's hard to find a job. Still a little bit complicated, but, but yeah. Any other questions I can answer at this point?
We have one more. Was your sister your only inspiration when you decided to switch majors?
Yeah, that's a great question. So she was a big one, like I said, because I'd grown up with it and thought about it a lot. But it was not my only inspiration. So I'll self-disclose a little bit here and say that my father also dealt with depression through most of his life. And as many of you might have encountered, but as I encountered, especially throughout my high school life and my college life, I had a lot of friends who dealt with pretty severe depression and anxiety and eating disorders and a variety of these things that were often really confusing because these people were so phenomenal and functioning so well in so many ways, and then somehow they were still dealing with these disorders. And that's crazy because they're all coming from the same organ, right? Like their ability to do so well in school and do all of these things so incredibly is coming from their brain. But having depression or anxiety or all of these other things is also coming from their brain, you know? So thinking about things like that also as I was growing up were really, really key in me making this decision that I have to know more and I have to be able to help with this. Anything else that I can answer at this point? All right. So the research that I did at the NIH briefly covered three major different types of topics. So the thing that this lab was actually really well known for and what they'd been studying the longest was schizophrenia. So I don't know how familiar you guys are with schizophrenia, but this is a pretty severe psychological disorder that affects maybe about 1% of people. It comes with a variety of symptoms that include things like hallucinations, so seeing things or people that aren't really there, or hearing voices that aren't really there. That's one of the most common symptoms of schizophrenia, is hearing voices. Oftentimes those voices can be saying things that are really upsetting, and so that can be really hard for people to deal with. They'll also be dealing with things like delusions, so feeling really paranoid because you feel like people are out to get you or are watching you or something like that. And sometimes people are aware that these things are irrational, but they can't help but be scared. And sometimes people aren't even aware that they're irrational, and they just truly believe that people are out to get them. So it can be a really, really frightening illness for people. And it's very difficult for us to treat right now. We have some medications, we have some therapies, but a lot of people really, really still struggle with this disorder. And so this lab was doing neuroimaging work, so those MRI images that I mentioned before, with people with schizophrenia to better understand how the brains of people with schizophrenia are different from the brains of those without schizophrenia, and how that can help us better understand the disorder and hopefully be able to treat it better at some point. So that was the first line of questioning that our lab was doing. The second, and so the types of things we did were this. So are you able to see my mouse when I move it around? Great. So we would do things where we'd take images of the brain that look like this. So these are MRI images and what they look like. And when we do analyses of these images, we're able to pinpoint areas like this little yellow region you can see highlighted, which is an area that we found that is different in its functioning between people with schizophrenia and people without schizophrenia. So this is the kind of research that we were doing. And then the second study, which is the one I was most involved in. Sorry, go ahead.
My question is, how do schizophrenia starts?
Sorry, can you say that one more time?
I was wondering, like, how do schizophrenia starts in the brain?
Oh, like how it begins? That's a great question.
How it begins.
So it's one we know not a lot about, actually. So we know that there are a lot of genetics involved in schizophrenia. So we think that there are a lot of genes that if you have those genes, you're almost definitely or very highly likely to develop it. And we know that because people who have a lot of family members with schizophrenia are more likely to develop it themselves. But other than that, we don't know a ton about why it starts, but it usually starts somewhere in people's anywhere between ages maybe 13 and 25, so kind of early-ish in life, but kind of when people are teenagers. And it usually starts off with low levels of those symptoms that I was mentioning. So maybe people think they heard a voice, but it's not really happening all the time, or they're feeling a little paranoid about things, but nothing super intense. And then it can develop and become more severe until someone has a full onset of that, in which case you see the full-blown symptoms of having these really intense hallucinations of hearing voices and things like that, and the other symptoms that were mentioned. But other than that, that's about all we know about how schizophrenia starts. And this is one of the things that I'll mention in a second, but is one of the reasons that I was really interested in continuing to do research, because the more you do research, especially about the brain, the more you realize that we know very little about the brain right now, less than you would expect us to know at this point in time. And so it just shows over and over why this work is really, really important. So the other study that I was involved in and that our lab did was in looking at children with Williams syndrome. So this is another genetic disorder with absolutely adorable children who are particularly characterized by being hypersocial, which means they are the most social people you will ever meet. They will run up to strangers they don't know and give them hugs and things like that, which is very cute, but can also be very difficult for people growing up because they don't understand the same social cues that most people do. And so here too, we were trying to better understand their social functioning. So we would have them do tasks where they were looking at different faces with different emotions. And then we would look at their brains and see how their brains responded to these different faces compared to people without Williams syndrome. Again, because we're trying to understand better how they deal with social cues and how that differs from people who don't have it. So again, this is the
That's a good question.
Yeah.
Sorry. So I read something recently that there are people like animal psychology. I mean, obviously you work with human beings, but is it true that they think that development of Williams syndrome in dogs is part of the evolution that Have you heard anything about this, where they think
I
that,
have not heard at all about
Okay.
research in dogs, but I'm going to look that up right after this.
okay, no, just because they were like, yeah, they think that when, like, what was it, 10, 20,000 years ago, when wolves first started, you know, like the nicer wolves started coming close to campfires and that kind of thing, that basically the development of Williams syndrome in dogs made them more likely to bond to humans.
That is
And
fascinating.
yeah, so I had just heard of that, and I was like, I'm going to hijack this. I know this is about the kids, but I have a question. So I just wanted to check in. So thank you for letting me interrupt. Sorry.
Oh, no problem. Thank you for bringing that up, because that's really interesting. And then the third type of inquiry, which was going to be most relevant to me, because this is what I actually ended up pursuing in grad school, is understanding how the brain changes during puberty. Now, I was shocked when we started doing this study to learn that we still don't know how the brain changes during puberty, what is important in brain development during puberty, how brain development relates to the things that happen during puberty, because we know that teenagers act really different from kids and adults, but we have no idea why. Like, it has to be related to the brain, right? Because we know that all behavior is related to what's happening in the brain, but we have no clue, or we have very little clue. We have some clues, but they're not super helpful. So I was here looking at understanding how the brain is changing throughout this period, from the start of puberty through reaching full adulthood. And we were also interested in understanding how these things related to hormones. So again, people think, and we have some evidence to suggest, that things like estrogen and testosterone, which are rising throughout puberty and are really rapidly changing, are likely really affecting how the brain develops. But we really don't know how. And it's really likely that it's related to these changes in behavior throughout adolescence and puberty. So based on that project and based on that research, I applied to grad school. I ended up here at Pitt, at the University of Pittsburgh, working with my PI, who is Dr. Bea Luna. And we study adolescent brain development. So while throughout this time I was mostly studying people with various disorders, because like I've talked about, clinical psychology deals with people with psychological disorders of all kinds. In grad school, I'm actually researching brain development in people with no disorder whatsoever. So we're looking at fully healthy people and trying to understand how their brains develop. And while that seems like it might not totally align with clinical psychology, I've been thinking and have thought since I started at this lab that this is one of the most important ways for us to better understand how psychological disorders develop. Because without understanding how brains even develop normally, how will we ever know what's abnormal, right? It doesn't make sense for us to be able to tell the difference without having a good idea of this is what brain development should look like. So that's really what we're trying to figure out, to be able to understand this is what it looks like when a healthy brain develops, and then being able to compare that to someone who developed a psychological disorder and say, oh, this is where it went wrong, so that eventually one day we will be able to see those things in advance and work to prevent them or to help people treat them earlier than we are able to now. Okay, so that is how I got to where I am. I was just going to talk a little bit after this about what the daily life of a psychologist looks like, which is very similar to my life in grad school now, so I can actually speak to that. But before I do, are there any questions at the moment?
It looks like, so Danielle had a question, but I know that she jumped in earlier. Miss Danielle, do you have another question, or was that from earlier?
I don't know.
Okay, cool. And then we did have a question from Raynell. She's asking, are you born with it? Is it congenital, or does it develop later in life, even though there's a genetic component to it?
Are we talking about Williams syndrome?
Sorry, schizophrenia, I believe.
Schizophrenia, great question. So no, you are not born with schizophrenia. You are born with the genes you have, but what we do know is that those genes do not 100% mean you'll have schizophrenia. right? So we know that there are all these genes that if you have them, you're more likely to have schizophrenia. But some people can have all those genes and still be perfectly healthy their whole lives and never show any sign of schizophrenia. And so that's because what we've realized is that a lot of these psychological disorders involve interactions between genes and their environment. So a lot of times the genes will be there, but if people grow up in environments that are totally lacking in the types of risk factors that might lead to schizophrenia. So really difficult childhoods, or various things happening throughout childhood and teenage years that might make it harder to cope with these things, then people might be more likely to develop schizophrenia. Whereas if people have these genes, but they don't have any of those risk factors, they grow up in really great environments, then they're less likely to have it. So no, there's nothing that says that they will definitely have it if they're born with those genes or something like that. But it's a little complicated.
Cool. Thank you very much. Yeah, for those of you who have seen the X-Men movies, it's similar to the way that a superhero mutation happens. It's like you don't know what's going on, and then there's a moment of stress or an emotional moment, and all of a sudden everything's on fire or you're magnetic. So
it's a great analogy. Love that.
Do what I can. Thank you.
Perfect.
What advice do you have for someone that is about to begin college pursuing a degree in psychology?
That's a great question.
Hypothetically.
Yeah. So I think that pursuing a degree in psychology in undergrad is one of the most versatile degrees that you can pursue, because people who end up with a bachelor's in psychology really can go such a variety of directions, because you need to understand how people work and how they think and behave in most careers, right? It's very necessary for anything you do. So if you're starting college in psychology, the things I would say are, one, to really be open-minded and curious about the types of classes you take and what you do there. Be willing to not just take the classes you have to take and that you're required to take, but to use that knowledge that you have to take those higher level, interesting classes that are really fascinating to you, those really specific classes. There might be a seminar that's totally about schizophrenia, or a seminar that's all about brain development. And really take advantage of those, because if you're in this degree and you really enjoy it, then there are so many different things that you can pursue. And college is the best time to get to do that, because after that, you just get more and more specific and it's hard to be able to branch out. But college is where you get to explore all those things about the brain and about behavior that we have, that we're trying to understand. So that would be my biggest advice, is there are still classes. I tried my best to do that in college, and there are still classes I wish I could have taken as an undergraduate. So take as many as you can and really pursue them. Okay, so daily life as a clinical psychologist. I am almost done. So thank you all for bearing with me. So as I've mentioned a lot, research is a huge part of what I do, and a lot of that involves really just figuring out what questions to ask. So the types of questions we're asking in my lab are things like, what differences in brain functioning are associated with psychiatric disorders, or how the development of brain connectivity affects emotion regulation. That's something that I'm really interested in. So how does the way your brain develops affect the way that you're able to handle your emotions or deal with them? Things like, how do pubertal hormones affect brain development? So that thing that I was studying at the NIH that I'm still interested in now and trying to learn more about. And the overarching question of our lab, which is, how does adolescent brain development affect cognitive functioning? Meaning, how does the way your brain develops through your teenage years affect your ability to think and do various things that are specific to humans, that humans do better than any other type of animal? So this also involves a lot of analyzing data. So as I mentioned, we collect these MRI images of the brain, and then we use computer programs such as this one to try to better understand how things in the brain are changing with age, or how they're different, like I said, between people who are healthy and people who are not, or any other question that we might want to ask about differences in the brain. And then we do a lot of statistical analyses because you have to use statistics so that people believe what you're saying, because that's important. So lots of making graphs, lots of math involved in this. Luckily, we have computer programs that do most of the math for us, but we still have to understand what's happening to be able to interpret it. And a lot of writing. So being in this field and being in any type of research involves a ton of writing, which a lot of people are not prepared for or don't realize is going to be necessary. But in science, one of the most important things we do is do all of these analyses, ask these questions, do these studies, and then we publish our work so that people, other scientists in our field and other people who want to know more have access to the information that we, or the, you know, what we found or what we've learned, because there's no point in us learning it if we're not able to share it with people and have people benefit from that knowledge. And so I spend a lot of my time writing and revising and submitting and then revising again and then submitting it. So that takes up a pretty substantial amount of time in this career. And then another way that we disseminate in addition to publishing is going to conferences. So one fun thing about being in research is you get to travel. Usually you don't have to pay for the travel either. And so a lot of times we'll go to these conferences that are on similar topics. So they bring together a bunch of scientists who are interested in the same type of field. So for example, we go to a conference every year that's specific to adolescent brain development. So it's pretty cool. There's that many scientists interested that we can have a whole conference. And then we present kind of more preliminary versions of our work that aren't quite ready for publication, but that we do want to start to get people's opinions on and see what they think and see what we could change or do differently. So that is something we do pretty frequently. And then the other two parts of my job right now are, one, clinical work. So I do a lot of therapy with individuals. I work with people with depression and anxiety and OCD and PTSD and a variety of other disorders. So I do that with adults, and then I also do a lot of therapy with children. So children who are either struggling with anxiety or who are struggling with behavioral issues, in which case we'll also work with their parents to help them understand better what they can do to help their kids succeed and to help their kids kind of do their best throughout their lives. That takes up a pretty significant portion of my time. And then the other thing we do, and so like I mentioned, if you wanted to work in a college setting, then the other part of your job would be teaching. So this is teaching usually lecture classes, but sometimes you'll have smaller, like 20-person classes that you can do a little more discussion style instead of lecturing, and will involve creating these lectures, creating assignments, all of the stuff that you experience now as a student. You'll be on the other side doing that as a teacher, which I did for the first time last year, and I had a lot of fun doing it. So it is also a great path to pursue. And that's all I have. Thank you guys so much for listening to me, and I am happy to answer any more questions that you guys might have.
Yes, I have a question.
Yeah.
So I'm Clay. Hi. I jumped in a little late, so I didn't really get a chance to listen to the beginning of your presentation. But I'm interested in majoring or minoring in psychology, but I'm not too sure if I want to go down that route or do sociology. So I've been like trying to figure out which one of the two I should do, and I was going to ask you for like tips or advice. Someone did tell me that pretty much like psychology is like the parent to soc, like everything, not everything in soc, because of course they're different, but the majority of things in soc you'll learn if you like do psychology, like if you take psychology. So I wasn't too sure in like which one of the two I should go or do.
Yeah, great question. So one, I'd say that I don't think you have to make that decision right now, because as I don't know if you were here for this part, but I didn't make that decision until halfway through college. So, so it is okay to not know right now. And I think that the fact that you are as narrow as you are right now is fantastic. But I would actually say something really similar to what I was saying about starting college with a major in psychology, which is to try to take as many classes as you can in a variety of different parts of it, and to try to take specific classes, right? So you might take your intro classes in both. You might take some intro psych classes and some intro sociology classes, but you should also really try to take a couple more specific classes within those, right? So look within the sociology department and find the classes that sound really specifically interesting to you, and then go actually take them and see if a semester of that is really interesting to you, or if you're sick of it by halfway through. Because that's where, right, the intro covers everything, and it's going to sound really cool, especially if you're already interested in this field. But when you get down into the nitty gritty, that's when you really figure out if this is what I really want to do, or I'm ready to move on now.
Okay, thank you. Because I took an adolescent psychology class, so that's what made me get interested. But I also want to do business management to like tie in the two. So that's why I'm not too sure if I want to just major in business and minor in one of the psych or social, or the other way around. So I'm still trying to figure that out now.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think business is really nice because especially if you end up going and getting another degree after your bachelor's, it's pretty flexible what you end up doing in your undergrad, and doing psychology or sociology will definitely benefit you in the business world. So I think that the nice thing is you do have that decision to make, but I don't think you can really go wrong.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, of course.
So there is another question, but I'm not certain on clarifying. But it says, do you think writing after researching a specific mental illness or someone who experienced trauma will help you understand its effects better?
Okay.
So is that question, just to clarify, is that, Catrice, are you asking if the process of writing up the analysis of the research helps the writer understand the disease better?
Trace.
I think she's asking if the process of synthesizing an analysis
I didn't get her answer.
helps you to understand the issue.
Yeah, I can answer that. So yes, 100% yes. I think that is a really insightful question, and it's 100% on the nose. So I think that a lot of times throughout the research, like I said, we have those big questions that we're thinking about, and at that time we're really thinking about how this all fits together and what might be causing these disorders or what might be linked to these disorders. But then we get really down into the nitty-gritty of, we got to collect this data, and we got to put these scans together and do these analyses and find the statistics and make the graphs. And it's only when we get back to the writing portion that we really get to go back into that conceptual level and try to figure out how all of those analyses and statistics that we have gathered actually fit together to answer the questions that we started out with. And so the writing portion of that is where we really do, like you suggested, get to synthesize that to better understand the question that we were asking to begin with. And that's one of the reasons that we spend so much time writing. I mean, we all write a lot, and if we wanted to just sit there and knock out the paper, we could. But a lot of it is, like you said, really focusing on trying to understand better what we were studying. So that's a great question, and it's right on the nose.
Any other questions? I haven't heard from the Foyer and the Durham sisters, or one of them.
And Rasul, I think we haven't heard from him.
I haven't heard from him.
Were there any challenges from when you were switching to psychology from music? Because I'm trying to think how to phrase this right. Were there any challenges from switching to psychology from music? Because I see that you wanted to do music for the majority of your life, and now you're focused on psychology, and that's what you want to do, and you want to go into that.
Yeah, it was really hard. there were a lot of challenges. That's a great question. So, I mean, part of it was just I was really nervous that I had already gotten halfway through college and then decided to change. I didn't even know if that was something that I'd be able to do. I wasn't even sure if I'd be able to graduate, you know, at the time I expected to graduate after doing that and having to take all these new classes and do all this research. So it was incredibly nerve-wracking, and that was a huge part of the issue. In terms of logistics and stuff, I think that my school and my advisors did a really great job of supporting me through it and helping me figure out how best to make it happen in the time frame I wanted to happen, and the types of things I needed to do to help myself get to where I wanted to go in terms of being ready for grad school and being ready for these things I wanted to do after college. So I think I had a really great support system in that way, in my professors and my advisors who helped me with that. And I think that our school also did a good job of encouraging us to make those switches by, there weren't a ton of beginning required classes we had to take that weren't specific to our majors. So we were able to be a little more flexible in that way at our school, which was really nice. But I think the hardest part was just, it was really scary to do it that late and to have, like you said, have had this one decision been made for so many years of my life, and then all of a sudden to be switching, and I wasn't sure if it was really the right choice. It is, I'm sure now that it was the right choice, but it was definitely scary then.
And another question, are you like, is there any colleges that you would like recommend for psychology specifically? Because I was actually thinking about maybe doing that when I get older.
That's a great question. I would say anywhere that has, that you can see has a lot of undergrad research opportunities, because being a psych major and being in anything like psych or neuroscience, the best thing that you can do is also be doing research, because these fields are so rapidly changing that just being in classes really isn't enough, because these textbooks are, you know, out of date by the time they're printed, because so much is changing all the time. So the process of research is really key to these fields. So any institution that has both the funding to have a lot of research going on, and that really encourages and supports undergrads doing their research there, I think would be a great fit. So I don't think there's one specific place, but I think when you're looking at colleges and when you're talking to people at those colleges, those are the questions I'd really ask. Like, are there a lot of undergrads involved in research? Are there a lot of supports to help you like find the labs you want to be in and to be able to continue to pursue it even along with your classes? Things like that, I think, would be the most important to figure out.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So the other question is, what is the most difficult part about being a psychologist?
Ooh, great question.
That's another speaker series.
Yeah, totally. I will, my short answer will be, I think the two hardest things I can pinpoint right now are, one, research can be really exhausting because you can put in a lot of effort and collect a lot of data and do a lot of analyses and still not come up with any answers. So everything that you pursue could turn out to be negative or turn out to be not what you thought it was going to be, and then you're kind of back to square one, and it has nothing to do with how much work you put in or how good your question was to begin with. So I think that can be really, really difficult and challenging for a lot of people in this field. And it takes a lot to be able to keep going after that happens, and it will happen multiple times. The other thing that's really hard, I think, is I absolutely love clinical work and love being a clinician, but it can be really hard to engage with people who are really, really depressed, who are really struggling, to be able to sit in a room with those people and really engage with that. It pays off, but it's really hard to do as you're going through it. So
I know things take time and like time's at an essence and stuff, but do you ever what was I about to say? Do you ever feel like all is lost? Like do you ever feel guilty if you can't like help somebody like as quickly as you would like or as much as you would like?
Oh, 100%. Yeah, I think that's a big part of this job. And a big part of it is also kind of learning to understand that that's going to happen and then being able to get through it to keep helping them, right? Because I think that's the most important thing is I know it's probably going to feel bad when I'm not able to maybe do as much as I'd like, but it's more important that I'm able to get through that and continue to try helping people so that at some point it will pay off. But I think that's a huge part of this. And it's something we talk about a lot of students here because it's important to learn to figure out how we personally are going to deal with that as we go through our careers.
Do you ever feel drained?
Sorry?
Do you ever feel drained?
Yeah, exactly. I think, yeah, that's a great word. And kind of what I was getting at with what's so hard about being a clinician is it can be kind of mentally exhausting to really be sitting with these emotions that are really difficult for people and maybe with things that have happened to people that are really hard to hear about. It can really be exhausting. And so in this career, it's really important to have a good idea of how to take care of yourself and be able to come home at the end of the day and separate yourself from what you're doing at your job so that you're able to take some time for yourself and really take care of yourself, because that's the only way that we're able to adequately help the people that we're trying to work with.
Yeah. And one thing that I'd like to add that I didn't realize until I became, some of my friends in college actually became mental health counselors and therapists of various kinds, is that most therapists have their own therapists. And that's something, Quay, that a lot of people don't know is that.
To say something about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially, and I know that, I certainly don't mean to speak over the current expert, but it's, it's often, from what I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, Ms. Orma, but that, isn't it a part of, like, as a doctoral student and like a residency, that kind of thing, isn't it a part of your supervision to meet with somebody else regarding your experience?
Yeah, so there's two parts to that. So we all have our own supervisors, both supervisors who are actual psychologists and supervisors who are just older students in our program. And their purpose, in addition to helping us better understand how to help our clients, is also for us to be able to talk about how hard it was to listen to this and how strongly I reacted to this thing my client said, or our emotional reactions to those things is a huge part of it. But in addition to that, it's also highly encouraged, like you said, that we go see our own therapists. One, to work through all of these things, but two, because it's so much easier to be a therapist when you understand what it's like to be at the other side. And without doing that, I don't think I would have the same type of insight I have. Being a therapist and seeing my client and knowing what that experience is like for them makes a huge difference in how able I am to help them.
Well, can we have a big thank you for Ms. Orma for spending the time with us in the middle of her research on Friday evening before a long weekend. Thank you so much. And can we have a little round of applause for her, please?
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you guys so much. It was so fun talking to you guys. And I am, in the future, if anyone has any additional questions, I'm always happy to answer them. So
thank you so much again.
Yeah, no problem. Have a good long weekend, everybody.
You too. Thank you so much.
Thank you.